Today we're going to look at the 4 most common types of basses used in most beats. I'm going to be breaking down when and how you might want to use them and what makes them different from each other. So let's get into it. Starting off, let's say I have my loop here. And now I added drums to the beat. As you guys can hear, these drums are pretty dense. What I did was I used a drum break and I layered my own drums underneath them. Same thing with the loop here. It's not as if it's just a simple 2-chord progression or anything. There's a lot of movement happening with the loop as well. Relatively speaking, the BPM is pretty high compared to most beats that you hear nowadays. So this is a common situation where it might be a good idea to use an acoustic bass in your beat. The reason why is because compared to other types of basses, acoustic basses end up taking less room in the beat and they won't be as big of a focal point. So using an acoustic bass, this is the bass line that I came up with. There are a few ways that we can create this type of bass tone. Obviously, you can go ahead and grab an actual bass guitar, but that might not be feasible in your situation. But the good news is there are a ton of VSTs that can actually generate a similar type of bass tone. Lots of them actually sample real bass guitars and let you play your own patterns using all the different notes that are sampled. For example, you can check out this plugin called Ample Bass Lite. It's free and it does the exact same thing that I mentioned. The one that I used in this example here was actually from Machine. They have a bunch of bass samples in their library that just sound pretty decent. Or lastly, you could just sample bass from another song and create your own pattern using that. I did a video a while back on that exact same technique, so check that out if you want a more in-depth tutorial on how to do that. If I open up an EQ and take a look at what's happening with this type of bass, there's not going to be as much going on in the sub-bass frequencies, and that's what makes this type of bass so useful. Just because they take up less room than the other types of basses that we're going to look at in this video. So overall, this is a good type of bass that you want to use if you have a beat that's higher in BPM. You have a lot of other sounds that are taking up a lot of room in the beat. In this example, the drums were really dense and the loop had a lot going on in it. And so this type of bass tone is good in this type of situation because it's pretty inconspicuous and it does provide bass without being completely overpowering. In terms of how we play this type of bass, you guys can see we can easily mix it up between having prolonged notes as well as shorter pick notes to create bass fills. It's pretty common to have no glides as well. Using glides with acoustic basses sound great and inoffensive when used. And so you see we have a lot of movement going on with this bass, but we can get away with it just because the bass isn't all that overpowering. Unlike the next bass that we're going to look at, which is the 808. So let's say I get rid of all my drums, I slow the BPM down to 70, and now I'm going to create a quick little trap drum pattern here. Alright, so now I'm going to use an 808 bass in this example. 808s compared to an acoustic bass, for example, are just a lot more in your face and just take up a lot more room in the beat. And that's why you'll find 808s work better with slower beats. You'll notice if I turn the BPM up of this beat, which doesn't really work out that well. The beat really does sound cluttered, and that's primarily due to the 808 just being so big. This type of bass really does work well with trap drums just because the 808 is so large and in your face, and the drums don't take up as much room. I explained this concept in a video I did a while back, so check that out if you're curious what I'm talking about. Looking at an EQ, you guys can see it has a lot more sub-bass compared to our acoustic bass, and it also has a decent amount of mid-range and higher frequencies, especially if you distort the 808. And so this type of sound is going to take up a lot more room in our beat and just going to be a lot more in the spotlight. If I were to swap out the 808 and substitute an acoustic bass, you guys can hear the difference. It doesn't quite fill up as much room in the beat as the 808 did. In the end, the 808 is commonly used more as a centerpiece in the beat. It's more of a focal point in the beat and it ends up being depended on a lot more. Most common places you can find 808s are in download packs. You can also make them yourself. I did a video on that as well if you want to check that out. It's also pretty common to have your 808s glide as well, just like we did with the acoustic bass, but maybe not to the degree that we could get away with an acoustic bass. As well, when it comes to creating bass fills with the 808s, the beat can really get cluttered easily if you get way too crazy with it. So you might want to be careful on that front. Just because the 808 is just so big and so prevalent in our beat, it just becomes a lot more inflexible in how we can use it. Speaking of flexibility, probably the most flexible of all the types of basses that you can use in your beats, it's the sub bass. This is the most versatile type of bass, and you can easily find this type of bass in most VSTs. Since we're using a VST to create this type of bass, we have a lot of control on how we want to shape it. Not only that, we can use it to be the main bass in a beat, but we can also use it as a supplementary type of bass. I'll show you what I mean here. Let's say I slow this beat down to 65 BPM, for example, and I created a new drum pattern here. For a very slow, somewhat sparse and ambient type of beat like this, a sub bass can be really useful. You guys can see it's pretty much playing throughout the entire beat, which is super helpful if I have a very minimal, sparse, slow beat like I have here. But I can also easily use this type of bass for a beat that's higher in BPM. Let's say I turn this up to 77. I switched the drum pattern around a little bit, but you guys can see I can easily take the exact same bass patch and play shorter notes and it still works. I don't have this bass playing constantly throughout the beat like I did when I had it at a slower BPM, just because it might end up being a little bit too dense, so I just played shorter notes in this example. So you can see this bass works at various BPMs just because we can be a little bit more versatile and flexible with how we use it. Additionally, sub basses are really useful for supplemental use. In the first example with the acoustic bass, I mentioned that it's very useful for a higher BPM type of beat, but if you try to use it at a lower BPM, it might sound a little bit too sparse, a little bit too weak. And that's when the sub bass comes in. What you can do is just layer this type of sub bass underneath an acoustic bass just at a lower volume. And it's going to go a long way in helping fill out the beat a little bit more if you have an acoustic bass and you're playing it at a slower BPM. Sub basses sound great when you use glides as well as bass fills, especially with moodier types of beats. Doing an EQ analysis of a sub bass, you guys can guess already. Most of the frequencies reside in the lower end and we just don't have much going on in the higher end. These types of basses are especially useful if you have a beat where you have a lot of other types of instruments that are taking up that mid-range. So if you use a bass that just focuses on low end, we're going to avoid making the beat a little bit too dense. Typically the way we get these types of basses, if you go into your VST, what you do is go into the filter section and make sure the highs are cut off up until the point where you're just left with these sub frequencies. And another great thing about using this type of bass is that you can easily go into your VST and change the shape around. Which leads me to the last bass that we're going to be looking at today, which is the synth bass. So if we delete all the drums here, I pitched my loop down a tiny bit and I'm going to bring the BPM up. And let's say I build out this drum pattern here. So this would be an example of a synth bass. You'll notice you can hear it in the mix a little bit more if I just soloed it. You can commonly find these types of basses in any VST. They should have a synth bass section. Alternatively, one thing that I actually like to do is not go into the synth bass section, but what I'll do instead is go into either like the pluck section or the mono section. And I'll take these types of sounds and just pitch them way down until they produce a sort of bass tone. Now what you might need to do if you want to do this technique, like I mentioned before, is take your sub bass and layer it underneath. And so it just feels a little bit more full now. Or again, I can just easily go into the synth bass section, just choose one of these. Again, if I open up an EQ here, you guys can see, unlike our sub bass, it just has a ton going on in these higher frequencies here, Compared to the other types of basses, like for example the acoustic bass, there's only so much tone or texture we can get out of that type of bass. Same thing with an 808, and that's especially true with a sub bass. But with synth basses, we can get really crazy. Not only can we introduce a very unique sound into the beat based on the preset or the plugin that we use, but because of that, it's going to be a type of bass that has a huge impact on our beat. Similar to the 808, just because it's so much more textured, it's going to sit in the forefront of the beat a lot more, which might be why you don't hear this type of bass too often in beats nowadays, but nonetheless, this can be something that you can use to really introduce a unique character into your beat. That's it, guys. Those are the 4 types of common basses that you'll find in most beats. If you guys have found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe. My free drum kit is available in the description box below as always, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.